an issue here. I must admit, when the allegation was made, I was racking my brains to think what could he possibly have said or done here, Tony Clubb, to Andre Cervello. And like, even as I was reading the statement, it was going through my mind. Like, all I've ever thought is Andre Cervello's from Warrington. It's never, nothing else had ever so it took a while for that to filter through and think, oh, but his heritage, his dad, his mum, they're from New Zealand, aren't they? And then obviously one of those has a Polynesian heritage. But it seems like a strange thing, like kind of what Neil was saying. I get what you're saying. It seems like a strange phrase to have said, but at the same time, I think the opposite of Neil. That makes me think possibly more it was said. Maybe not meant to be nasty. Maybe totally clear of thought, like of any sort of actual thought process, and just shows ignorance and stupidity. If he is guilty of saying that.
Yeah, well, I never thought it was
a connotation of pointing to someone's ethnic origin, whilst wrapping it up in a nasty thing, means to those people of different heritages to, just a white English person, basically.
Yeah, but it's in my social science, it's othering, isn't it? It's separating people based on a particular characteristic that they have. It's got nothing to do with their ability or otherwise. Tony Clubb never struck me as the sharpest tool in the box in the first place.
But similarly, I've never thought of him as a nasty, horrible bloke, but I don't know him at all, so it's hard for me to sort of pass on that. I think some people ask me, was he aware of anything like this from him before or anything like that? And no, other than the odd late tackle and that sort of stuff, Tony Clubb's got a pretty clean history and record, and all I've ever seen with him off the pitch is him stopping for pictures in Asda and that sort of stuff, good stuff, getting involved in initiatives by the club in the community, good stuff. So obviously this has come from a spat, hasn't it, during that little melee, and we don't know what has been said both ways, and we know that there's people who struggle to understand the difference between what you might say to someone who is a white English person, like if you called him a southern twat or something, versus pointing to an ethnic background that has been colonized and no doubt looked down upon where it's more in its locality, not necessarily maybe here the same, but certainly it will be within the the suburbs of New Zealand cities and things like that, no doubt. So or historically, there will be prejudice there. People think of these islands as being, I don't know, quite barbaric or kind of backwards or what have you. And that's been a historic thing, hasn't it? That these islands are just full of people in tribes who aren't educated and stuff. That's certainly not the case as we see them, today in those cities in those islands. But it's worrying if it's been said that it shows the lack of education and thought about the meaning of, like you say, associating the other words that were said to an ethnicity.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you can call him every name under the sun based on his ability to handle a rugby league ball, but it's this thing about pulling out an element of somebody's characteristics that have got absolutely nothing to do with your complaint about him as an individual on the field.
Yeah.
The kind of, there shouldn't be any difference between a spat between Cervello and Clubb as there was a spat between Hardacre and Connor. Do you know what I mean?
Cervello and Isa, or
exactly.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because Thursday night was, there were elements of spitefulness and nastiness in the game, weren't there? We'll talk about that later, but there's an element of competitiveness in that is completely separate from you making comments on people's heritage or people's other things that are completely irrelevant to what's going on the field. And that to me is what this whole initiative's about. It's about, not separating people based on that kind of nature, and thinking about them in terms of the rugby league family, as horrible a term as that might be to some people.
In terms of potential outcomes, like I said, if he's found not guilty of this charge, I would really hope to see some real open communication and displaying of the evidence to sort of say why this was a mix-up that got taken to the lengths they got taken to, but ultimately it didn't happen how it was remembered, or what have you. Or if he is found guilty, I would certainly expect and applaud a significant ban, with an expectation that the Wigan Rugby Club would do some sort of holding back of wages or fining or something the player for the period of that ban, that he's made himself unavailable for playing for the club. But similarly, do something to make sure there's an education piece here for Tony Clubb and for other players, across the league. And I'd also want maybe Andre Cervello's comments to be explained a little bit around he was just going to leave it to be sorted out on the pitch, because I worry that if this happens and we don't know about it more, and if that's the case, we need to be bringing it into the open to go through this education process to prevent it being something that happens in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very glad it's been brought to the attention of the match officials. The same way that I was glad about any other kind of, previous kind of things of this nature relating to not relating to somebody's race or heritage, but based on people's sexuality, for example. Those kind of things, they're very important that those kind of things are brought into the light, because that's what ultimately kind of gets these things seen and understood, and people appreciating them for what they are. It's about trying to build a greater understanding of us all. The last thing I'd say on it, really, from my point of view, is I'm glad he's come out and made the allegation based on what he heard. That doesn't mean that he's guilty or otherwise. It just means that that's what he perceived it to be. I just hope the process is transparent, and we know, and we kind of hear what evidence has been presented, what is known, what is unknown. Because ultimately the difficulty is it is potentially one person's word against another. So we will. I just hope we are, the kind of the process is as transparent as it can be in the circumstances.
Yeah, and we'll see. We'll discuss the long-term consequences of anything that happens afterwards. I think.
Yes.
Okay, we had some other feedback, some nicer feedback to talk about, I think. So I'm going to start with Lee Breer's fact-checking from Neil Ormston. So after me and Sarah made the reference to Breer's stats being fact-checked on last week's show, he felt obliged to reply. Of course he did. I goaded him into it anyway. He said, "The good news is that the figures quoted were much more accurate than the published league tables have proven to be over recent weeks. Breer's is indeed Wire's all-time top point scorer with 2,586 points in 425 appearances. His 74 drop goals is also a club record, and to answer Scoots' question, 11 of those came against Hull. Though the most he scored against one club in total was 12 versus Wigan. Didn't help him to beat us 20 trophies, did it?" Neil said, 1 point of correction. He only scored 3 against Hull in the match that Sarah referred to, a 1916 win in Warrington's last ever visit to the Boulevard in their 2002 season, when Neil explains they were so shit that it was their best way of racking up points. His record equaling 5 in a match was actually at Halifax 3 weeks later, the last of which put us 11-10 up, only to let in a last-minute try and lose 11-16. God, so that meant they were the team that lost to Halifax in their relegation season, isn't it?
Yeah, because Halifax won one match that year, and it must have been that one, yeah.
Although I think they got a points deduction, so didn't actually get any points. I can't remember if it or if they finished on I can't remember. Again, Neil, tell us. For anyone else actually, any listeners who like this sort of stuff, head over to rugbyleaguerecords.com. Now we've talked about this before. There's an SLP short between me and Neil that talks a lot more about the Rugby League Record Keepers Club website. You can sign up to see records from every summer era club match, which is currently being tested. These records are before a wider public release, hopefully at the end of the year. But if you want to get on board and support those efforts, Rugby League Record Keepers Club, go to rugbyleaguerecords.com.
Yeah, I keep meaning to do that because it's only £5, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I keep meaning to do it, and I will. Thank you, Neil, for getting back to us, because I think that might deserve a fiver.
Yeah. Two people got in touch on the topic of NRL conferences, which again is more hearsay than news, so we've kind of jumped it into the feedback section, especially because, Alan, for about 7 years of this podcast existing, I've talked about it about 700 times and written about 7 blog posts about it. But the idea of conferences, but this is applying to the NRL rather than to the European game. But do you want to take us through the first of these about the proposed idea of setting up conference system in the NRL, which at the moment sounds like they're talking about a Sydney-based and a non-Sydney-based conference?
Okay, so David Hunter says, I wrote the NRL an email pitching 2 9-team conferences in 2010. Now they're thinking about it. Is he attaching those two things? I'm not sure they're related, but anyway. I have my doubts. I just really need it to be a regular season, so any 2 teams can meet in the grand final.
And Alan Walker said the very old conference idea is back again, and in the NRL, a Sydney conference and a non-Sydney conference shows how short-sighted many Sydney RL people are. Sydney teams travel by bus, other teams by plane. Much better would be to draw the teams. If you miss playing a club one year, it makes even more special when you play them next. Instead of playing the same 8 teams twice a year, again and again and again. I think one of the things for the NRL actually is a conference-based system gives you an opportunity to balance the fixture list a little bit, because you could play your own conference twice a year, every year, and the other conference once a year, every year, rather than this sort of strange, convoluted draw that they end up with to not have too many games, a prospect that we just can't comprehend in this hemisphere.
Yeah, I mean... the number of games they play at the moment, it doesn't seem fair in terms of the whatever particular model they use. But I don't know if turning it into a conference is actually going to change that. You know, if you're not prepared to pay each team home and away, then whatever system you come up with is going to be, obviously the NFL is the classic example, and they're always talking about strength of schedule, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
As a measure of, you've got a chance this year, you've got no chance this year. So, yeah, I don't know.
I think lots of other things come into play, especially over a 20-odd game rugby league season. Injuries, that sort of thing, loss of form, bounce of the ball. So strength of schedule is just one factor. I think it allows you to consider expansion in different ways, and also gives you an opportunity for a more balanced look to your seasons. I do still think as well, if you had conferences, let each conference play off to get their own winner and then have your Super Bowl, as it were, as your grand final. I still think that works too. I don't see a need to worry too much about it. I don't like the Sydney conference, non-Sydney conference idea. I don't like that at all. I think that adds even more to the sort of power imbalance. For a start, within Sydney, we've already got a huge imbalance between basically 2 or 3 clubs, maybe 4 now with the Panthers being so strong. Whether they'd be in the Sydney conference, I don't know how exactly it would be able to work. I assume they would, but they're kind of a bit further out, aren't they? But yeah, you'd keep some old rivalries in place. You'd keep Cronulla and St George in the same conference, and East and South in the same conference. You'd keep Manly and the Eels in the same conference. Those sorts of things could still be maintained, and yet still have a better split. I think it's I think I like it. I'm in favour of it, as long as it's done sensibly, and not to kind of insulate Sydney Rugby League and go back to some old world where it's Sydney versus the rest. Then I think I'm all in favour.
Yeah,